Just gonna hit that before I forget. Hey, everybody.
Afternoon.
That you have a Zoom password.
A few new faces. Christy, I think you didn't join us last time, so we'll give you a little quick 2-second catch up once we start, but welcome.
Thank you.
And Mike Tremblay, I think you're new to our group. Welcome.
Hey, how you doing? Nice to see everybody.
Yeah,
Nice to see you.
thanks for coming.
Pardon me while I move my computer to where the outlet is.
It's never easy. I find every time I switch from like WebEx to Zoom to Team, sometimes I have to reboot. It's just, yeah. The virtual gods are not kind to me.
I'll say there's about 16 of us, but just hit 1 o'clock. So maybe we'll just wait another minute and see, get a few more.
There we go.
Great, seeing some familiar names and faces. Thanks everyone for joining us for our second PAG meeting.
Kind of 7, right? Is that, or 6? 6 or 7?
Yeah.
Something along that line.
And I see Bruce Hyman is here. Bruce, I don't have you on the PAG roster. Which organization are you with?
Bruce is with the city, I believe.
Yeah, Bruce is with the city. And it looks like he was on the email.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
City of Portland.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Hey, Bruce.
Are they gonna be seeing me?
They're seeing you now.
We can see you right now.
Well, I brought my lunch and I just didn't want to be,
You look lonely there at that big table.
well, you know, Greg, Glenn said he's gonna hold my hand, so.
So is that it's conference? Is that the Metro conference room?
Yeah, I'm Ed Knutson, I'm the union president, so
Yeah,
I guess my name today instead of Ed Knutson is conference.
there we go. Very, very great. All right. Well, it's a couple minutes past 1. I think to be respectful of everyone's time, and we also have a lot to cover today, we'll go ahead and get started. Joe, do you want to go ahead and share?
Yeah, let me do that. Can everyone see the slide with the ferry on it?
Yep.
Yep.
Excellent.
Great. Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We've got another great turnout and look forward to robust discussion over the next hour and a half. And like I said, we've got a lot to cover. Before I jump into the agenda, though, I do want to just say a quick introduction of myself and our team. And for those of you who are unable to attend our first project advisory group meeting, we spent some time going through introductions. We're not going to do that again, but I would love anyone who did not join us last time to just go ahead and say hello and introduce yourselves. So for the benefit of the group, but I will start. So for those of you who I have not met, my name is Amy Patine, and I'm the project manager on the consultant team. And and I work for Nelson Nygaard. I'm a principal in our Boston office in our transit practice. And I'm joined today by Dan Perez, Joe Poirier, and Ann Galbraith. And again, we're the consultant team who's leading Transit Together. And so it's going to be a little tricky because there are a few of you on the call, but if you weren't here at the last meeting, if you don't mind just coming off unmute for a second and just saying hello and introducing yourself and what organization or agency you're with.
I'll go. Hi, I'm Christy Gaddis. I'm the Director of Resident Services with Portland Housing Authority.
Thanks, Christy.
I'm Hope Cahan. I'm the Vice Chair of PAX. I'm on the Falmouth Town Council. I'm also the Chair of Metro. And for my day job, I do policy advising for a Santa Clara County supervisor out in California on all of our transportation issues.
Thanks, Hope.
Mike
afternoon,
Tremblay,
Jim
I'm with the
Bennett.
Greater Portland Metro, Director of Transit Development.
Thanks, Mike.
Good afternoon, Jim Bennett. I'm the city manager for Biddeford on the PAX policy, and also trying to do my best imitation of Bullseye, the dog from Target.
Thanks, Jim.
And I'm Jonathan Graven from Casco Bay Lines, handle finance and human resources.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anyone else? Okay, great. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. And as you can see, there's quite a few members of the advisory group, and happy to share a list, actually. I don't know if we've done that yet, of who all the participants are, just so you can see both, you'll see both the staff and leadership at the transit agencies across the region, as well as some of the key municipal and institutional stakeholders and partners. So really great group to help guide this effort. And so our agenda for today's second advisory group meeting is I'm going to give a quick project update on what we've been up to since we last met. And then we're going to give a presentation on some of these key early deliverables that we've been working on for this effort, namely the transit market analysis and our existing conditions work, looking at existing services in the region. And then we're going to introduce our microtransit task, talk a little bit about what microtransit is and how we'll be looking at it as part of this effort. And then rounding out our meeting, we're going to talk about public outreach, which we talked a little bit about at the last meeting, but we're starting to gear up for our first big round of outreach coming in early 2022. And then we'll wrap up with any public comment, as well as what our next steps are in this effort. So with that, if you could go to the next slide, Joe. You see, we'll continue to sprinkle our photos from our site visit throughout. So since we last spoke or last met, we have finished our stakeholder interviews. I think we had done some prior to our last PAG meeting and had a couple post. And again, these were conversations, some in person, some virtual, with all of the transit agencies in the region, as well as the state DOT and the PAX co-chairs and the GPCOG team. Super useful and candid conversations around, what folks would like to see in terms of future transit needs, sometimes getting into specifics, sometimes talking about the rider experience and opportunities for improved coordination, but just a lot of great feedback for our team that it helped to inform both our existing conditions review and additional work that we're doing around just getting a better handle on opportunities around coordination of transit services. And again, focusing on that coordinated and seamless rider experience. So those conversations, more to come, but the first big round is now complete. Our market analysis is also complete, and Joe's going to be presenting the highlights of that today. And then the full document will be available in draft form for your review as well, and to provide comment on between now and the end of the year. And then if you did take a peek at our slides that I sent out last week, you'll see that we had a whole bunch of appendix slides because there's just a lot to go through. So if you have any questions on, quite frankly, any of that, this discussion today will be an opportunity to answer those. And then we're well underway with our existing conditions report. There's, as you can imagine, a lot of data to sort of sift through, and a big thank you to all the transit agencies. It was not an easy ask on our part in terms of all the information that we were looking for in order to conduct that review. And so we are well underway, and we want to share with you some of the highlights from that work. But that report will be on the heels of the market analysis and also shared with you in draft report form in the coming weeks. And then we have been preparing for a first round of public outreach, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about today. And then just identifying opportunities. And I'll talk about this at the end, talk about this more at the end of the meeting, but again, taking all of our market analysis work and existing conditions work and starting to turn the corner into thinking about opportunities for improvements in the system or across the systems, and then prepping for our microtransit work. The next slide, Joe. We shared this slide at the last meeting, but just again, want to reemphasize that public priorities have been fairly consistent for over a decade. This is across several previous planning studies and outreach efforts. We, with the help of the GPCOG staff, sort of consolidated comments and summarized them into these following categories. And again, we want to be mindful and sensitive to where the public's at in terms of how often and when they've been asked in the last few years the different efforts of what's important to them, and really use that as an opportunity to be clear in our charge and hit the ground running. So these topics on the slide in front of you are really what we're taking as our charge, and as we look to make improvements to transit services in the region and using them to guide our work. And then just a reminder of what the key tasks are in this effort. So state of regional transit, you'll hear us referring to this. This is a combination of two key documents, market analysis, and then those stakeholder interviews and existing conditions, which is again a review of services and coordination in the region, and then the feedback that we'll be getting from the public as part of that first round of outreach. And that's going to comprise again, what we're calling state of regional transit, which is our understanding of what's working and what's not working today in terms of provision of transit services, or what could be improved upon. And then from there, we'll be moving into network improvement concepts, where we'll be developing scenarios. I'll talk about this more in next steps. And then more one-on-one and on-site conversations with agency staff and operators who really have the most intel to share in terms of what's working and what they'd like to see improved, and use their input along with our technical analysis to develop some scenarios, and then head into a second round of public outreach to get the reaction to that. And just to make it all even more interesting, here in the GPCOG region, we are also doing a microtransit feasibility assessment, which will also be part of what we share with the public in terms of not just fixed route service improvements, but potentially new models of service to meet some of the unmet need in the region. And then to tie it all together, what we're calling seamless transit is to be thinking about, again, how the 7 providers in the region can work together more efficiently and effectively to provide a seamless experience for riders. So again, we're mostly in that state of the regional transit task right now, but these are the other kind of moving parts around it, and just wanted to give that big picture overview of what our charge is throughout this entire effort. And real briefly here's the schedule, and you can see that we are coming up at the end of 2021, finishing, again, that existing conditions work, and then it's going to get really busy as we head into 2022 with more on-site visits on our part and meeting with stakeholders, transit agency staff, the public, and starting to produce more products and reports for your review as we develop alternatives. Okay, and with that overview, unless there's any questions, I want to, again, make sure we stay on schedule because there's a lot to cover. I'm going to hand it over to Joe, who's going to provide an update on our market analysis.
Joe, if I just want to let everyone know, Joe's going to walk everyone through a lot of the technical work that's been done so far. So we'll have a chance for discussion at the end of each of these. But if you have anything, burning comment or question you want to put in the chat in the meantime, feel free to jump in or put it in the chat.
Thanks,
Go ahead, Joe.
Great, thank you. And Amy, could you just monitor the waiting room while I'm presenting?
Yep,
Thank
definitely.
you so much. And I think I see there may be some members of the public here, some names I'm not familiar with from the last PAG meeting. So thanks for joining us. Just wanted to let you know there's a public comment period at the end of the meeting. And we'll have slides in time for that. So going to go over the market analysis, which is one of the two sort of state of regional transit deliverables that we've been working on at the beginning of this project. Quickly going to talk about the purpose, some of the methods we use in the market analysis, why we're doing it, and then show you some maps. And I think hopefully you all had a chance to peek at some of those maps before the call. We sent out the slides because it's going to be a lot of information to go over very quickly, but we'll also have time to discuss it at the end of this section and at the end of the existing conditions section. So what is the point of a market analysis? It's really to understand where there's demand for transit and where different markets for transit exist in a region. And that in turn helps the region match that demand with their values and decide where and what type of service should be provided by transit agencies. So one of the things we've looked at in the market analysis is if we can identify sort of some preliminary gaps between where there's demand for service and where service may not be provided that meets that demand or that type of demand in the region. So we'll look at some maps of that. And we're mostly using publicly available data, so nothing secret or black box. This is all stuff from Census Bureau or from GTFS feeds in the region. So hopefully it's quite transparent. And this chart here just kind of gives an overview of the way that we think about densities, both residential density and employment density, and how that might match up in certain contexts to the frequency of fixed route service that could be provided. So you see in places with a lot more jobs and a lot more people living there, you would expect to support a much higher frequency of service. So buses that come, say, every 10 or 15 minutes as opposed to every hour. So this is kind of like one of the two essential elements of a market analysis, and that's the population density. Where do people live? The other one's employment density. Where do people work? And I think it'll come to no surprise to people on this panel that Portland and also Biddeford-Saco are kind of the most densely populated parts of the region. So you see density is very heavily concentrated on the Portland Peninsula and some of the neighborhoods outside downtown Biddeford. But by and large, outside of the Portland area and the Biddeford-Saco area and a few other sort of downtowns, it's a very low density region in terms of residents. So you see in Portland, as many of us know, the density is highly concentrated on the peninsula, but there are some relatively residentially dense neighborhoods outside the peninsula in South Portland, in the Deering area, and in Westbrook. And down in Biddeford-Saco, Old Orchard Beach, Biddeford is really the most residentially dense community near downtown. Likewise, employment density largely concentrated in the Portland area, although there are some clusters of employment density outside Portland in places like Biddeford-Saco, Freeport, Brunswick, Sanford. If we zoom in on the Portland area, we see that jobs are very concentrated on the peninsula, although there are some concentrations in the East Deering area out near the airport, Main Mall, parts of South Portland, for example, out by Southern Maine Community College, and parts of Westbrook. And likewise, in the Biddeford-Saco Old Orchard Beach area, employment density is really concentrated in Biddeford, but also to some extent across the river in Saco. So if you look at population density and employment density together, we develop these maps that we call composite density, which is essentially slightly weighted combination of population and employment. So the darker areas are places that have a greater composite density, and the lighter areas have a lower density. And so you can match these densities to the amount of service that could be provided in an area, the amount of transit service. So you see here, and we'll zoom in, the darker colors are places that might support higher frequency transit service. So that's mostly the Portland Peninsula, but to a certain extent, places outside the peninsula in Saco, Biddeford, Old Orchard Beach, and areas outside Portland, and in some of the communities that are not a part of our study area, but are connected to our study area via transit, so Brunswick, Sanford, places like that. If we look at the Portland area, we see that the composite density is significantly higher on the peninsula than anywhere else, but also to a certain extent in East Deering. And And there's a relatively high demand for transit in South Portland, out by the main mall, and in parts of Westbrook. The composite density down in Biddeford, Saco, Old Orchard Beach is highest in Biddeford, to a certain extent in Saco, but mostly downtown along Route 111. Another thing that we look at in market analyses is where is short-term development occurring. So this could be projects that are planned, that are in construction, that are proposed but likely to occur. And so what we've done is made a few maps showing the developments that are sort of in the pipeline, and how large they are scaled and relatively weighted towards the type of transit ridership they might support. So, for example, residential or major commercial projects might support a little bit more transit ridership than, say, for example, a large industrial park. And we look at this because these developments that are occurring in the short term are likely to have significant impacts on the transit network. For example, if a large apartment complex or a large commercial building is developed somewhere where there isn't transit service, that might be a place to consider serving with transit. And likewise, if developments occurring along a transit route, that might suggest that that route could be upgraded in terms of frequency. So in the Portland area, we see a lot of development happening on the peninsula, but also some significant projects happening outside of the peninsula that may impact transit service in the region. So Rock Row, the homeless shelter in Riverton, and then a few residential projects in South Portland, particularly the Betsy Ross House expansion, and some condo projects in eastern South Portland out by Willard Square, Southern Maine Community College, that area. There's also quite a few developments happening on Commercial Street in Portland. So the Portland Foreside proposal and the VA clinic and the Portland Cold Storage building. In Biddeford, Saco, the development is largely concentrated around downtown Biddeford and the mill complex there. There are some relatively large residential projects that are proposed or planned for areas outside the downtown core. So we've just kind of highlighted some of the projects we think are important to think about for short-term transit planning, short-range transit planning. This image on the top right is the Portland Foreside proposed development on Commercial Street. This image on the bottom right is the homeless shelter in Riverton, and then other projects that we're thinking closely about are Rock Row and the Betsy Ross House expansion. We'll highlight some of those in a moment. We also look at commute flow. So where are people traveling to and from for work? And this does not capture non-work travel, which I think is important to note, but it does capture a considerable amount of the travel that occurs in the region. And I think it's not surprising to most people that Portland is really the hub of commute travel in the greater Portland area, although there is considerable travel into and out of the Saco Biddeford area, and to a certain extent Brunswick and some of the smaller communities like Sanford and Freeport. In the Portland area, I think the commute flow patterns are a little bit less intuitive, and there's some interesting things here. Obviously, there's a lot of commuting to the peninsula, downtown, but there is considerable commuting occurring between areas outside of downtown. So for example, from Westbrook to North Deering, between Westbrook and Scarborough, between Scarborough and South Portland. There's a good amount of travel that's occurring that's not headed into and out of downtown Portland. We've also looked at access to healthcare and groceries, as well as jobs. And we didn't include all the slides here because we have a limited amount of time. But that is something we can go into. We've made some maps that show essentially areas with more access to healthcare, groceries, and jobs, and areas with less access to healthcare, groceries, and jobs. This map is healthcare in particular, and essentially the areas that don't show up with color are areas that we flagged as potential gaps in terms of healthcare access via transit. So for example, South Portland, parts of North Portland, and Falmouth. But one of the things we wanted to talk about with everyone is this sort of gaps analysis. So these maps are showing transit demand versus transit access, and then highlighting in yellow here places where there might be an imbalance between the amount of demand there is for transit and the number of jobs that can be accessed via transit. So you can see, Portland is relatively well served, but there are some yellow clusters here on the map around parts of South Portland, Westbrook, Biddeford, Saco. And we'll zoom in and we'll look at those in a second. So here's a sort of what we're calling an underserved communities map. And you can see some of these yellow highlighted areas occur in South Portland, out by Willard Square, Southern Maine Community College, parts of Westbrook, parts of East Deering, the Red Bank area in South Portland by the airport. And this is the same map in Biddeford, Saco, Old Orchard Beach. So you can see some of these potentially unserved communities in Biddeford, downtown, Saco downtown, parts of Old Orchard Beach. So these are our key findings. I'm getting the messages that we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'll speed things up a little bit. But we wanted to, these are what we wanted to focus the conversation on. One is that planned development is occurring in the Portland area, and it is likely to have significant impacts on the provision of transit service in the near term. So the places we've highlighted are Commercial Street, Riverside Street in Portland, but there are others. There are some surprising commute flow findings, such as there's a little bit more non-downtown centric commuting occurring in the Portland area than may be expected. And there's also some limited downtown commute flows from places like South Falmouth. We'll highlight that in a second. And then we've also identified a few service gaps. Those are the maps we just looked at. Service may not meet demand in certain parts of South Portland, East Deering neighborhood, Westbrook, and some other in Biddeford Saco area. So just to recap some of the planned developments that we wanted to highlight and talk about: Commercial Street Corridor in Portland, the homeless shelter in Riverton, Rock Row, and some larger developments in South Portland.
Hey, Joe, can I interrupt you for a sec? I just figure while we're here, some of the questions have been about development. What is the timeline? Are these all permitted or planned developments? How far in the future do these developments go?
It's a mix. Some are under construction, some are permitted, planned, proposed. I'd say some of them are in construction, so happening now. Others may not occur for 5, maybe more years. So it's a blend, but the idea here is to kind of capture where the land use is changing and where we need to think more about changing the type or amount of transit service that's provided.
Okay, yeah, Donna, you're pointing out Cushing's Point. Is that one you're familiar with, Joe? Or
yeah, I believe that's in the proposal phase. That's not yet planned. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Donna. I guess that might be the reason why it's not showing up, that it's not yet permitted, or it's just a proposal at this point. So wouldn't be here. And then Al also from Maine Health was pointing out there may be a couple of healthcare facilities that should be on this map, and we can follow up with him on that. So
okay, yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've certainly missed a few. There's a large development in Westbrook that's not on here, the vertical farm project.
If anyone sees any others, we're capturing the chat. So feel free to, if you know of a development that you think we should consider and see if it is actually planned or permitted, that would be great. And then, yeah, the other question in terms just while we're here is, are we looking at future, all the employment density numbers you went through and population, those are current year, right? That's 2020, not future?
Yeah, it's current. It's not 2020. It's 2019 5-year ACS estimates. So it's as recent as is publicly available.
Let's keep going, and we'll get to the other questions at the end, but I just wanted to, while we had the development map up, I wanted to get to those.
Okay, great. Yeah, some of the commute flows that we identified that are interesting, there's not quite as much commuting from South Falmouth as may have expected. There is considerable commuting occurring outside of the downtown core. Service gaps that we've kind of identified and may be worth talking about are Frenchtown neighborhood in Westbrook, Red Bank, parts of eastern South Portland near Southern Maine Community College, Willard Square, and parts of East Deering in Portland. Also in Old Orchard Beach, Biddeford, Saco, there's certainly some places where there may be service gaps.
Yeah, and we can just go back to the previous slide. Jim Bennett, if you don't mind coming off mute, you noted that you think this growth or the some of the density here in Biddeford is underestimated based on, so it's 2020 census data or the most recent estimates. So we're not looking at future growth. So I'm hoping you can clarify your comment, whether you're thinking that we're not capturing future plans or.
Yeah, I mean, the community obviously has gone through a rapid change in terms of the perspective of what people think of the community. I mean, we went from being one of the oldest communities to the youngest community in the state in a very short amount of time. The rents in the community in a 5-year period have just gone through the roof because of its popularity. Some work that I've done has indicated that for the 10 years leading up or 7 years leading up to when the community tore down the incinerator, we lost 19% against the market based on the median selling price of a single family home in the immediate area. And since that time, we've gained almost all of that back, and we're accelerating at 5 to 10% more than what the same communities are right now. Again, it's a perception issue. We got about 40% of the mill space that still is vacant. That's not included anywhere on this list. It doesn't include 5 to 6 buildings that are being proposed right now that we have an agreement for development on the former main energy site. Between that plus some of the stuff that's going on and potentially will go on Saco Island, I think the numbers are just living in the old paradigm of what Biddeford Saco was, not what it will be. And I think you're going to find that the analysis is going to be pretty seriously flawed given the rate of change.
Yeah, so I guess, Joe, any thoughts on that? I think we're looking at more short-term in terms of, actual density rather than mapping out long-term in the future.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the actual people living in Biddeford now, I think we've captured that relatively accurately. I can think of a way that we might capture the past couple of years even more specifically. That's a good thought because things have been changing so rapidly in Biddeford that a 5-year estimate might be a little bit conservative. And in terms of the planned development, the projects that are underway or online, I think it's definitely possible that that bubble map that shows the bubbles, we may be underestimating the amount of development that's occurring and the population and jobs that will be added. So it'd be good to follow up after this call and make sure that we've captured that accurately, because I think you're right. We need to fully understand what the implications are for transit in the area if we're underestimating population or jobs growth by thousands.
Well, I mean, the other point is that if you're using the same methodology to predict where the needs are, and you're basing that on the fact that the communities are going to be essentially the same as they were before, except they're going to grow a little bit, that doesn't work for the Biddeford Saco area. Because just think about the dramatic change to go from one of the oldest medium age to the youngest medium age in a short 5-year period. Think about how dramatic that is.
Are there other, can anyone think of, is there another location that wasn't reflected in the plan developments?
I mean, it was hard to tell because it's just a circle here, but I'm hearing that you're going to come back and take a look at that and maybe double check the assumptions that were used in terms of looking forward because if we have the wrong assumptions moving forward, then we're going to have the wrong analysis, which means we'll have the wrong conclusion, which means based on what I'm seeing right now is that it will continue to be Portland centric in terms of where most of the demand is. And the demand is still going to be Portland centric. That's a given, but it may underestimate. I'm going to argue that it is going to underestimate what's some of these other community patterns. A lot of the people that lived in our community have moved out of the greater Portland area and are moving into Biddeford Saco area.
And I don't know where, this is Nell Donaldson from the city of Portland. I'm not exactly sure where the development projections came from, but we could add some as well if you guys want to sort of refine some of that bubble diagram. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how much of a difference it's going to really make down the line, but we're happy to provide some comments on that if that would be helpful to you guys.
Definitely. Yeah, and I just want to reiterate this is our draft market analysis. Is really the feedback that Nell and Jim and others are giving that's going to help ensure that we are getting an accurate lay of the land and bus network redesigns. And our charge here is to develop, short-term strategies that can go into implementation in the next year to 2 years, and then set up the transit agencies with the tools to better guide their investments in the future where development may occur. So we're not looking long-term horizon, but totally appreciate, Jim, your comment that we need to acknowledge the trends that are happening on the ground and make sure that we're accurately, even in the short term, predicting where growth is going to be occurring. And we are seeing pockets. I mean, sure, Portland is absolutely popping, but there's definitely portions of South Portland as well as Biddeford Saco area that are popping up on the maps as well.
Yep, and we appreciate the feedback. That's why we do these meetings, so we can hear from everyone. And I also wanted to highlight the potential for additional transit service in the Sanford area. It does show up on the map as an underserved community, although it's not technically in the service area. It is connected via fixed route transit in the study area, excuse me. So those are the key findings that we wanted to go over. Do we want to talk a little bit more about these? Do people have other questions? And did you have some, did you have anything you wanted to target specifically?
If anyone has a question, feel free to ask it. I think we, development, hopefully we're going to get some feedback. Maybe there were some things we missed there. Any comments on the commute flows? Was anyone surprised by that, or the underserved areas? Maybe if you could go back to maybe one of the underserved areas, the one that focuses on the Portland area.
And Hank has his hand up, Ann.
Oh, sorry, Hank. Go ahead, Hank. Yep.
Thank you. I don't know if it will make a difference or not, but early on there was a chart of land use type. I know it's not generally thought of during this kind of analysis, but islands are a unique land use type, and where transit is a lifeline to the islanders. And I think it's important to include that and note that.
Great. Yep. That's certainly true. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, in the actual market analysis report, we may get a little bit more into the specific or more in the existing conditions report, some of the needs and, specific services. So that might come up in the next section. I just want to, on this, this gaps map, are there any that, does anyone see anything that jumps out at them that surprises them? Or did we maybe miss an area that you're surprised is not showing up as a gap? Any thoughts on this? Oh, Greg, go ahead. So you have your hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, the one thing that surprised me a little bit is the identification of a gap in Westbrook. And we don't need to dive into it now. I would just ask for maybe a deeper dive on that finding, because we have improved service in Westbrook substantially beginning in 2018. And looking at the areas where you're noting there being a gap, the transit service there, depending on what you assume for a distance in terms of accessibility, is fairly robust. So I'd just be interested in talking more about that offline. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah. Sorry, what was that, Ann?
Any quick thoughts on that's based on employment density there, probably, right?
Yep. Yeah. No, I think what Greg's getting at is if you can. It depends if you consider walking across the bridge access or not. I think that's a good conversation to have, because there's a lot more transit once you get into downtown Westbrook than there is across the river. But that's certainly something we should talk more about, because there's a lot of people there, and I think a high need for transit.
Yeah, and so a couple other people have their hands raised. I can't tell who you are because it's, but go ahead and jump in.
Looks like Donna and Jim have their hands raised.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Donna.
I'll go ahead. Yeah. So can you send your assumptions, how you came up with the gaps or areas that the service needs aren't being met? I'm trying to look at your little diagram in the PowerPoint, but I can't read everything.
Yeah, definitely. And I can maybe try to explain it a little better right now. Essentially, the areas that are highlighted in yellow, those are places where we've identified a significant demand for transit. So essentially a large amount of population density at its very essence. So a lot of people in a small area. And then those are also places where under the existing transit service, you can't necessarily get to that many places from those locations. So there's a lot of people who want to go places, and there's not really a lot of places they can get to on transit. So that's essentially what those yellow areas are showing. So in many cases, like in South Portland, there is bus service, say out by, in Willard Square, but it may not take you to quite as many destinations as, say, for example, the Metro Route 2 on Forest Ave. And so it shows up on this map as less access via transit, if that's helpful at all. But we can definitely send you the actual numbers.
There'll be more information when the full report is posted. Yeah. So Jim Bennett, did you have a question?
I think maybe Donna had a follow-up, or.
Sorry, I thought I was muted. You're saying yellow, it looks white to me. Is that the lighter shaded areas are the what you're referring to as yellow?
So maybe a poor choice in colors, but can you see how there's many like sort of blocks here that are highlighted in yellow, outlined in yellow?
Okay.
Like census blocks. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm trying to look at the graphics and just want to understand it. Okay, thanks.
Mr. Bennett, did you want to?
Yeah, but it appears that the analysis right now is sort of focused on people leaving their residence and going to an employment center and vice versa. And I'm wondering, at any point is the work going to take a look at trying to be able to provide alternative to people using their own personal vehicles to get around in like downtown areas or the highly dense areas, to try to serve as a way to make it so individuals don't have to necessarily live outside of the downtown area. To put an illustration on that, we have pushed hard to try to have a circulator in downtown Bedford Sauk Hill that's free in order to deal with the densities that we now see in the downtown, try to get the vehicles off our downtown, out of the downtown that don't need to be in there, and try to have a free service that's available. So my question is that going to be part of the study at any point, or is this really limited to the traditional transit thinking of individuals from where they live to employment centers and to places where they need to get for critical services such as food and medical providers?
Yeah, I think it's funny, we actually just had a conversation about this morning. Another thing that we are looking at in this study is access to healthcare and access to groceries, sort of like some of the essentials, places people might have to go on a daily basis via transit. So this map shows gaps just in terms of access to jobs, which I think it's good that we note that. And we're considering making like sort of a similar map that might show access to a more holistic suite of destinations. So groceries, healthcare, and jobs. And then when we get into the service planning, we definitely look at some of the specifics, like can people in this area on this route get to these important destinations they might go to?
I guess what I'm guessing, the point I'm trying to make is I think the study should include the opportunity to take a look at the most dense areas that we have the most service demands and find out whether or not, if transit was rethought in those areas, i.e. the downtown Bedford Sauk Hill, where you had free and regular, predictable, continuous movement in the downtown area for people to hop on, hop off to get to the different places they need, that would eliminate having to have all the vehicles in the area as a part of the overall strategy. I could see something very similar being planned for the peninsula, maybe potentially out in the Jetport area. I'm not sure, but the areas are really dense. to look at that transit differently than just moving people from their home to something they need.
I think that
Yes.
is the next step. Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
No, I was going to say, yes, we agree. I mean, density is what drives demand, and appreciate looking at population density. So I think it's population density, it's access to jobs for economic opportunity, and then it's also access to everyday needs like healthcare, grocery, and thinking about equity, because that's quite frankly what most transit systems post-pandemic recovery are doing right now, getting out of those peak commuter flow times and thinking about transit as a viable alternative for all kinds of reasons. But yes, it's a great point, and I think you're right, the peninsula and downtown Biddeford are great examples of opportunities for us to dig into thinking about those types of high frequency service that could really make it a true alternative for people and help with congestion and promote economic development. So
And I'll also just very quickly add that, you know, we definitely are looking at those in high density areas too, but a lot of those needs for needs also exist in some of the lower density areas. And that's part of where the microtransit analysis might come in later, is how do we provide a similar level, you know, provide a similar opportunity for people to live car free or car light in areas where maybe a high frequency circulator wouldn't work. And so we really, as we get into network design and the microtransit analysis, are really looking for, like, here are these key issues we've identified in our market and service analysis. What tools do we have to solve them?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
yeah. And I think Rob had his hand up earlier at least, but then we should probably move on in the interest of time.
Rob, did you have a burning question or something you want to, a comment for us?
No, I think it was addressed. I just think it's interesting. I had a question about whether the areas demanding transit were just strictly based on population density of folks living there, or if it was also based on the jobs that were, did there need to be an overlap between those two? Because I'm just thinking about how people are flowing around the town, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think Joe, certainly there's a component for both population and other demographic factors, you know, households without autos and other factors as well, I believe, right, Joe? Or
Yep. Yeah, we didn't show every map and every bit of the market analysis in this presentation, but we're also totally looking at incomes, at people who don't have access to cars, because we know that there's definitely some people who are more likely to ride transit, some people who would rather ride transit, and some people who need transit more than other people. So we definitely take that into consideration.
And then that's taking into account the current transit schedules in those areas as well?
Yep.
Great, thank you.
so in the interest of time, because we still have a lot of technical stuff that I want to make sure we get through with you all, the questions and comments are great, and we love to hear them, but I want to ask Joe to keep moving. I do want to just say, given Dan's lead in on microtransit as well, and there was a couple of questions on microtransit. We do have a couple slides that is a separate task in the study, so we're going to get to that at the end. So I'm holding on those questions, and we'll get to those as we get to that section of the presentation.
How are we doing on time? Do I need to go really fast on this?
Given that we have great discussion, maybe try and move a little bit faster, and then that make sure we have time to really get all these great comments at the end of this next round.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe.
Oh, gotcha. I'll increase my coffee intake.
It's all good stuff.
So this is the existing conditions that we're going to talk about right now. And this is sort of the second bit of the state of the regional transit work we've been doing. And existing conditions is really focused on understanding the basics of the service that's on the road right now, or on the road and the rails and the ocean. So it's what type of service is being provided, where is it being provided, when is it being provided, what's the context for the service, how has it been changing over the past 10 years in the region, how is the service currently performing in terms of things like ridership, on-time performance, productivity, and then all the other things that are really important and closely related to making potential future changes to the transit system. Things like, what are the fares look like, what types of facilities are available, what types of vehicles are being operated. And so these are the 7 agencies here in this table on the right, and we think it's important to just call out that it's a very complicated transit network. There are a lot of different people operating a lot of different types of transit, and then there's also transit agencies in the region that aren't included in this study. And so these are the private bus operators, other ferries, and it's important that we keep connections to other transit in the region in mind as well when we plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about the context for transit in the region. So this is looking at historical data for the past 10 years up until the data are available, and that's 2019. So I think everybody knows this is pre-pandemic. Things have changed dramatically in the past couple of years. So the data we have is basically what was happening to transit in the region up until the pandemic. And so this chart shows the amount of fixed route service that was provided. And the takeaway here is that the amount of service being provided in the region by every agency has been steadily increasing over the past 10 years. And so some agencies have increased more than others, but overall, everyone's been adding more service. Likewise, ridership has increased for every agency over the past 10 years. I think that's not a big surprise. There's more service on the road, growing population. There are more people riding public transit. That being said, when we look at productivity, and productivity is typically measured as the number of people riding transit every hour, so boardings per hour, sort of a standard transit productivity measure. When we look at productivity, we see that it has slightly declined for most agencies, most of the study agencies in the region. Biddeford, Saco, and the ferries, productivity has increased, means they're carrying more passengers per hour, but the other agencies are not. So they're adding more service, they're getting more riders, but on an hourly basis, they're not carrying more riders per hour. And that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's a very complicated issue, but it's important to understand because it will drive how some of the service design decisions that are made in the future. And if we look at demand response service, we look at YCAC and RTP, the amount of demand response service has been declining over the past 10 years prior to the pandemic. And we know that has a lot to do with how Maine DHHS awards NEMT or non-emergency medical transportation services. And that some of this is outside the sort of the policy decision control of RTP and YCAC, but I think it's important to note that the amount of service has been declining, demand response service. And likewise, the amount of trips being made by people on demand response service has been declining in the region for these two providers, YCAC and RTP. But productivity has remained relatively stable since about 2014. There's a little dip on YCAC here in 2015, but more or less the amount of people carried per hour by these agencies has been relatively consistent. We're also looking at the span of service and the frequency of service that's available. And so this is more or less every route that's operated in the greater Portland area among the study agencies. And one of the things that I think is notable is the span of service is really quite strong. We have a lot of routes starting early in the morning, 5, 6 a.m. and running until some past 10 a.m. at night. And in a region like Portland, where does not have tremendous population densities, that is not a major metropolitan area, this is quite a good span of service for most of these routes. Frequency, you can see these bars. Each bar, horizontal bar, is a route. The darker the color, the more frequent the route. There are several routes, mostly in Portland, that operate between every half an hour and every hour. But there aren't really any routes in the Portland metro area that operate more often than every half an hour. And I think that's notable. I know there's lots of conversations happening in the greater Portland region about potentially having more frequent service, but that's definitely something we'll be looking at in the study.
Pause for 1 second, if you don't mind here. I want to Patricia noted a question as to, or a comment as to why this may not apply to rail. Patricia, do you want to share a little bit about why you think that? Maybe Joe can help explain.
Well, I think on the efficiency piece about the number of riders per hour, the fact that our first trip leaves Brunswick, Maine at 4:30 in the morning and the last trip doesn't get in until 2 o'clock at night is really not as relevant a fact that there are, 5 round trips a day. And so the number of hours versus the number of trips really isn't a good assessment, and it doesn't create an accurate picture of our efficiency.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to note that all the services are very different, and in many ways it's a completely apples to oranges or apples to pineapples comparison. All these services have different purposes. In addition, they don't all just carry people per hour. Some of them have totally different purposes. An intercity rail system is completely different from a local circulator bus, is completely different from a ferry that people need available to do very basic things. off
So
island.
maybe as you put slides together about, decreasing efficiency, it's really not true, because the fact of the matter is, with the same number of round trips, we actually are carrying more people per trip. So the efficiency hasn't gone down, it's gone up. So as these are public documents, it just tells the wrong story. So maybe clump these as, like modes or something, so that those that don't fit that model, just characterize them differently, instead of trying to put us all into the same bucket where we're not the same.
Yep, noted. Thank you.
Thanks.
In terms of frequency, we've also mapped out the routes that have the higher frequency, and I think it's no surprise that most of that higher frequency is in the Portland area, mostly on the peninsula, but stretching off certain corridors into Westbrook, into Gorham, and down to the main mall. This is sort of a close-in look at that. We've also started looking at ridership, and this is ridership by stop. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about the ridership period that we're using, which is March 2021. And we know there's an incredible amount of seasonality in terms of some services, and we'll look at a chart of that in a second. But there's definitely, I think there's pros and cons with using sort of a summer ridership assessment period versus a spring or winter ridership assessment period. But we can see that in general, most of the ridership is heavily concentrated in downtown Portland, also in Saco, Biddeford, and in the Portland area, although there is some ridership in some of the smaller communities outside the Portland area, notably Freeport, Brunswick, Gorham. And when we look at these maps, essentially the dots, the bigger the dot means there's more ridership at that location. And then the dots are pies. They're broken up into different colors, and each color is an agency. So for example, up here in Brunswick, see the dot is yellow and blue. That's yellow is the NEPRA boardings and blue is the Metro bus boardings. So in the Portland area, I think one of the things that's notable is there are very distinct ridership corridors. So Main Street, Brighton Ave, Route 25, out to Westbrook, Forest Ave, to some extent Washington Ave and Stevens Ave in Portland. And there's a great deal of ridership out by the main mall. We look on the peninsula, there's a significant transit corridor down Congress Street where many of the buses operate, but there's also major ridership destinations at Hannaford's, Maine Medical, the Portland Transportation Center, and then obviously at the ferry terminal. And then in Biddeford, Saco, the picture is a little more difficult to discern just because there are some data issues there. But we do see that ridership is generally clustered in downtown Biddeford on the island, and then out at UNE, and then along Route 111 at a lot of the shopping destinations and some of the medical facilities there. And so this is that chart of seasonality of ridership that I mentioned earlier. It's essentially, it's showing ridership index to January. So like how much does ridership change up or down as the year goes along. And so you see for two agencies, for Biddeford Saco Transit and the Casco Bay lines, ridership increases dramatically, like 300, 400% in the summer. I think that's no surprise to many people. And then other agencies have much less of a seasonality factor. You know, Metro has a slight bump in the spring and the fall, as does South Portland. And then some of the smaller providers also have shoulder season bumps. But I think it's worth discussing the seasonality a little bit. We also looked at some of the interagency connections. There's a lot of transit facilities in the region, a lot of shared transit facilities, which is a really good foundation, I think, for future interagency service. But one of the things that we've identified is that, and it's not just us that I've identified this, I think we all knew this going into the study, but there's a real disconnect in terms of intermodal connections in Portland. The downtown bus facility is not near the ferry facility, is not near the rail and intercity bus facility. They're all very far apart. And so understanding how to better connect them is going to be an important part of the study. So in terms of key findings, we wanted to highlight the distinct transit corridors in the area. but also that there is some existing what's called covered service that goes out into areas with relatively low demand for transit, and that there's basically higher frequency services mostly concentrated in the Portland area right now. There's also higher ridership on those transit corridors. And we also wanted to highlight that ridership has been growing on every service, but productivity has been declining for many of the services. And also that ridership is highly seasonal. And then with respect to the connections, there's a lot of shared facilities. There's a good foundation for interagency cooperation in terms of service, but there are some major intermodal barriers getting between the different modes of transportation. So just to recap, these are some of the corridors we talked about, the sort of distinct transit corridors in the region, including Broadway and Portland, which I don't think I highlighted earlier.
Maybe we can just pause here for a sec, Joe, if you don't mind, if anyone has any comments on the corridors as we go through some of these key findings. So I know GPCOG is moving forward on a study in more depth to look at development of potential rapid transit alternatives on that Westbrook corridor that Joe highlighted. Are there other corridors? Do you agree with the ones that are highlighted as being the strong corridors? Are we connecting them the way you expect, or are we missing something? Any thoughts from anyone?
I think Rob has his hand up.
Yeah, I think to that question, I would say the corridor on South Portland Transit connecting the mall to downtown South Portland is one worth considering, given the proposed South Portland's redevelopment of the main mall is going to include considerable residential development. That's the hope, and there's new condos and permit buildings already that are built there. And then I guess just as a question, I think it'd be really interesting to identify how long from certain transit points it takes someone who gets on a bus to get to, say, downtown Portland. My experience is with South Portland, but if you're going to shift people to public transit, it can't be 3 to 4 times as long as it takes to drive that distance. And so I think that's worth quantifying across all these routes. And if the idea is to reduce car traffic, to think about, if you're running it every 60 minutes, but it's 30 minutes to get across the bridge, but it's actually 10 or 15 minutes in a car, you're never going to get folks who have that choice. And I recognize many people don't, but the ones that do, to choose public transit in the way that they do in larger municipalities.
Transfers definitely affect that as well. And I think, Joe, that's something all that will be looked at as you start to piece together ideas, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Transfers, and then frequency relates to that a lot, because if there is an expectation that there's a transfer made, if the bus only comes every 45 minutes, that transfer is not super useful.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the slide of public comments collected over the last 5-10 years that Amy started with, that always rose to the top, right? Fast, direct, frequent service between key activity centers is, no surprise, one of the top public desires. Yeah. Hank, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know the technical definition of a transit corridor in this context, but there'll be many of you who aren't going to be surprised that I would suggest that the island corridor is very important for different reasons than a traditional look at transit analysis. It's the lifeline for the people and businesses out on the island. So it's arguably more important, or as important, at least, as any other corridor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good comment. Patricia, I'm imagining you have a similar comment, perhaps.
Well, a little bit different. I guess one of the questions that I have, we talked a little bit about, seasonality and then these corridors and back to, I think, some of Hank's comments too, that I haven't heard anything about tourism related. I mean, given the spikes in the summer season, I mean, tourists really play a big part of congestion and parking and cars and all of what we have. And that's obviously a big reason for some of the spikes on some of the services, particularly in Old Orchard Beach and on the islands. And so is the tourism market one that's considered at all? And then I guess my other comment is, we are a transportation transit provider within the region, but we also go far outside the region. And I guess a similar thing is, travel patterns of people that come from far outside the region into the area, and where are they going and how to address that. So I just think it's worth just thinking about a little bit more.
Great. Yeah, great comments. Joe, any thoughts on either one of those points?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tourism question is huge. It's like, and there's a lot of decisions, value-based decisions to be made there. Do you allocate resources towards serving a tourist market in the summertime? It's obviously a huge economic driver for the region. A lot of people go to work in the summer season for tourist-related industries that don't go to work in the winter. Is this a type of a situation where you want to have different summer service and different winter service patterns, like Biddeford, Saco, Old Orchard Beach does? Is that something that's important to the region? Should service levels change? Should the destinations change? Should there be tourist season only routes or only trips? I think these are a lot of the questions that we should probably talk about, because it's a big ridership generator for the tourist season, big time.
Thanks. A couple more questions. Greg, Jordan.
Thanks. So 2 comments. One is just on the issue of the boardings per hour and the finding that our productivity is decreasing in the region. I just wanted to contextualize that a little bit, at least as it relates to Metro. I don't think we had, at least before the pandemic, any kind of structural changes in ridership. We did have at Metro anyway a major expansion of service in 2018, which got annualized in 2019. And so with the higher level of service, as we all know, ridership often takes several years to mature with these sorts of improvements. I'm confident that, but for the pandemic, they would have. So I think that's part of the reason why you see a productivity decline in Metro's case. So I wanted to question the finding that we might have a structural problem here in the region, which I don't think that we did, at least again, as it relates to Metro. My second comment relates to, I think the corridors that you've identified and the analysis makes sense, and agree with all the comments related to making sure we're trying to capture the other markets as well in relation to tourism, et cetera. But I wanted to ask about your look at the Route 1 corridor more broadly. We're zeroed in here on the greater Portland area right here. But how does the Route 1 corridor from Biddeford all the way up to Brunswick sort of stack up in this analysis? Or is that outside sort of the boundaries of sort of this analysis and maybe more appropriate for our rapid transit studies going forward?
Well, we did look at that, and I will say that the ridership numbers on that corridor are considerably lower than you might expect, given the amount of travel that's happening on that. And I think part of that is due to the time period that we looked at, which is post-COVID. We're not looking at pre-COVID ridership. So there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable riding the bus or riding the train anymore, that are probably driving. But it's overall, it's not as high a ridership corridor as some of the ones that have been identified in the Portland area. But I think there's a lot, to Jim's point earlier in the call, I think there's a tremendous amount of growth happening down in Biddeford and Saco. So maybe that's a corridor that, even if the ridership isn't super high on it right now, maybe that's something we need to look at more closely in terms of what the next couple of years might look like, and especially if traffic congestion gets significantly worse on Route 1 or 95.
But going back to your slide in 23, the commute flows, and again, this is of course looking at commuting, and as we go forward from the pandemic, we may be wanting to look at things other than just commuting, but the commute analysis does show significant demand between travel demand, not necessarily transit ridership, between that whole corridor. So I think that's a really important one to have us be looking at.
Noted. Thank you.
Yeah, COVID throws a wrench in all this. We're also collectively trying to figure out. Jim, I want to ask, maybe you have some comments on the corridor going down to Biddeford.
No, that wasn't what I was raising my hand for. I don't know where everybody is on their own personal DEI journey. So just bear with me for a moment. Basically, from a racist standpoint, which is all about impact, not intent, I think it's really important that this study is very deliberate about taking a look at how our transit system currently serving our BIPOC community, because public transportation has always been used as a poster child of one of the examples of public policy that is inherently racist. And if we don't do that work, we're doing a disservice. If we're able to come up with a system that is centered around the ability to provide equal opportunity to BIPOC individuals in our region, then we know that we will end up in a place where we will have been able to serve everybody in our community equally well. So I'm just planting that seed that I, as one member of the policy committee, would expect a very deliberate look at that as part of our review.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that was captured in the market analysis, right? Was there the socioeconomic, so we have those maps?
Yeah, we have very intentionally looked at race, even though, you know, there's a lot of debate, I think, in the transit world about how closely race is actually tied to transit propensity. But there is obviously something to that. And I think we've also looked at immigrant status in terms of market demand. And we know that especially in the Portland area, where there's a large refugee community, we have to be intentional about looking at how transit service provides access to people who may have significantly fewer resources than people who have been here longer. So yeah, we've looked at race, we've looked at immigrant status. I believe we've also looked at English speaking, it's called LEP, limited English proficiency populations. So it's all noted. I agree, it's tremendously important. And I think we should probably continue to raise that issue as we proceed with the study.
Okay. Donna, I think we'll take one more question. Donna, you had your hand up, and then we'll move on to the microtransit analysis.
Okay. Yeah, I would just, as far as the productivity, we implemented Saturday night service on our Route 21 prior to the pandemic. And I think that's definitely bringing down productivity. We have a job out there. It's on the road on Saturday nights, and ridership, before it could even be established, we were hit with COVID. And then as far as the Route 1 corridor, so GPCOG has funded a study for the Scarborough Downs, which I don't know if you looked at that planned development. I mean, there are permits for that. And even if it doesn't go all the way down to Biddeford-Saco, we are looking at options, and tying into Al Green's comment earlier about their main med campus. We're looking at options to maybe taking one of our routes down to service the main med campus in Scarborough. So I'd like to maybe see something on that Route 1 corridor, at least down to that major employment and medical services facility. So that's all.
Thank you. And then Chad, I see you're asking how 1 and 11 stack up.
Yeah, the
volume of ridership.
Sorry, the question there was just, you know, in these existing corridors that were identified, we don't see anything pulled out further than really the Portland centric view. So is it because there are no other corridors of similar attribute, or is it because of a limited real estate in the slide?
I think it's a combination. The Route 111 corridor has fewer riders than some of these corridors in Portland that we've identified, but in the region, it's probably the primary rider.
Barely see me.
Okay.
There's somebody who's I'm gonna mute you, iPhone. Yeah, I think it's an important corridor, and it's definitely something we're looking at. So the reason it's not in this presentation is primarily due to the massive amount of slides that we have. And I apologize, we probably should have included that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I think we're gonna just move on because I want to make sure we cover the microtransit analysis, because there was a lot of questions and comments about that. So yeah, I'm gonna keep moving us on. If we get to the end, we're happy to stay on the line and answer more questions, but we'll let those people drop off that need to. So
all right, I'll take it away. So one of the tasks included within the study is a focus on microtransit. And so I think before we talk a little bit more about the task, I just wanted to level set and talk a little bit about, what is microtransit? So microtransit is a term that's used to describe an evolution of demand responsive transit service. And some of those services are already available in the Portland region and are operated throughout the country. And microtransit services, as they're branded, are typically using vans for on-demand trips within a defined service area. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of increased interest in microtransit as new market entrants have introduced new technologies and service models within the traditional demand responsive concept. And those new market entrants have introduced ideas or kind of service models and technologies around on-demand trip requests and on-demand service, more advanced and automated routing algorithms. They've improved upon customer-facing applications for booking, payment, and vehicle tracking. And then also for, on the kind of service operation and design side, new in-vehicle apps that make it easier for transit agencies to deploy the service. And then also a lot more ways to configure service design, basically leveraging all these tools to deliver different service models or different ways of customers interacting with demand response service over time. So, based in an existing concept, but a lot of growth over the last couple of years. And so as we kind of go into this task, we really think about microtransit from some key questions and potential use cases. We always start our microtransit studies, and we'll definitely start this one with the key question, which is what problem are we trying to address? So the question isn't how can we use microtransit specifically and try to kind of find the use case for the technology. We really start with, what problems are we trying to address, and then we start thinking about, could microtransit help address those problems? And we also think about that from both a user experience and an operational perspective. So how could we potentially make demand responsive services that exist now work better for riders, be easier to operate? And how could we potentially introduce new service models that address some of those key problems we're trying to identify? And so there are a whole host of use cases for microtransit. And so we're going to start with existing service and market analysis and help understand if there are some problems that we've identified within those that could be met by, that identify use cases that could be met by microtransit, and also continue conversations with all of you. And then we're also going to do some additional market research that really kind of hones in on demand responsive questions. So on the next slide, just has a quick overview of that, really focusing on both the policy, operational, and customer outcome that could be delivered with microtransit. And our outcomes could be a recommendation of a specific microtransit service and use case and operation strategy, but it could also be leveraging some of the new technologies or service models to improve or augment existing services that are being provided in the area. So it's really not a kind of prescriptive approach to a study. We try to do this organically and really fit the problems and the use cases to or start with the problems and the use cases and see if the technology or operational strategy makes sense versus starting with the operational strategy and trying to find the use case. So yeah.
Yeah, I just want to give, is it Stephanie? Are you the one who's on the phone from Southern Maine Regional Planning? You were noting that you guys are doing a study on microtransit now with the Sanford? Or is that Regan? I'm not sure who's on.
No, it's Stephanie. Hold on. Hello. We're actually doing a joint land use study through the Department of Defense with the town of Kittery and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. So the shipyard is a major employer down here in our MPO world. And they employ about 9,000 people that come from mostly come from inland communities, Sanford being one of them, and then across into the New Hampshire border, So people are coming from those areas and commuting into Kittery. So we originally in the JLUS project looked at possibly extending a fixed route transit that's currently operating by Coast, which is a New Hampshire provider. when we actually kind of got into the task a little bit more, we realized that microtransit might be a better fit. So now we're sort of kind of going down that road, and we're finalizing a report on that probably the end of this month. And we're trying to now work with maybe YCCAC, DOT, and some other stakeholders to try to move that along to see how a service would be designed. So we're kind of in the preliminary stages of it, but we're continuing. We actually have a follow-up for this project, so we'll continue implementation with support from the Department of Defense moving forward, I think, for the next year, and this will likely be one of those tasks as well. I just wanted to mention it because I know microtransit is a focus for this study, and you know, I think we might be actually a little further down the road in some cases on that work. We could be helpful.
That's great, certainly. Yeah, well, sure, Dan will want to touch base with you and learn more.
Yeah, it seems like a great opportunity to collaborate a little bit.
Yeah, and we just to mention, we had a consultant working. This portion of the study was actually supported by our ARPA funds through Maine DOT, and we have Foursquare. Foursquare is our consultant, and they've done a wonderful job actually doing some cost estimates and looking at equipment needs, capital needs, that sort of thing.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dan on the microtransit, which is really, that was just a sneak preview. We're just starting to get ready to delve into it, but any questions about methods or strategies? If not, I'm going to keep moving because we're almost out of time. We've got a few more things just we want to talk about, our upcoming outreach and next steps. So we talked a little bit, we gave you all a sneak preview about public outreach next time. And the big news is, I think anytime momentarily, hopefully later today, the Transit Together website is going to be updated, and this project will be integrated into that website. So if you look, hopefully later today, maybe tomorrow, to be on the safe side, you'll see that we're starting to put information up there on project background. It will be the repository for project documents. There'll be a way for people to sign up for updates, and as we start to conduct outreach, any information on that will be posted on this site. So please take a look. Let's say tomorrow, hopefully, and let us know what you think about that. And feel free to share that with any of your constituents. As a reminder, we talked last time about how, we can go to the next slide, Amy, we'll have 2 rounds of public outreach. So we're getting ready to start the first round, and it will be largely virtual. We're going to plan to have 1 virtual meeting. We'll have lots of documents posted on the website, and what we're hoping to do is to drive people to the website to start looking at the documents and get familiar with the study. And we're not going to be at that last bullet, gathering public ideas for routes and services. That's really in round 2. We are fully cognizant that the public has been asked many, many times about what sort of things they're looking like for in terms of transit in the area and what their needs are. So we really just want to share the documents with them at this point. And once we start developing more specific ideas that hopefully respond to their past comments, then we'll be looking for more specific input from them. So this first round, hopefully in the January, February timeframe, we'll have 1 meeting, but really be pointing people to the website. And the last time we spoke with you at our first meeting, we asked you for ideas, and you guys all shared a lot. I know, Allie, you said you have a listserv. There's the Homeless Voices for Justice, and I've got Rob and Nell. A lot of you gave us ideas. We recorded all that, and we're hoping what we'll do is some outreach to people to post flyers, driving people to the website and the information just to get people involved from the beginning. So stay tuned for all of that. And I think we have 1 more slide. Yeah, this is just kind of our strategy for this upcoming outreach. And like, as I said, we won't be doing any surveys. really on specific ideas. People have been surveyed enough. We're going to wait until we really have some ideas that we want specific feedback on. Oh, and just we are going to try and underserved communities. Just one last point here. We are going to really try and outreach in these areas where we think maybe there's a disconnect and imbalance between some or really underserved areas. Those are places where we do want to try and hopefully use your resources to get flyers and information out to people and try and get those people engaged in the study. So that's our task for early this winter.
Thanks, Anne. And we'll follow up and send the link out once the website is live and as materials are posted. So again, you can help us get the word out. And as we get closer to in early 2022 to sending out information to the public about that first round of outreach, again, we can share our combined list and have you help us figure out who we're missing so that we can particularly target those underserved areas. So just moving on to our final section, comment and next steps. We do have a few minutes saved for the end for public comment. So I'll go through these quickly, but just as a recap, we've been talking again about this sort of first stage of our analysis, the state of regional transit. Really appreciate all the thoughtful comments today. We will take those and any future feedback we get from all of you as you take a look at the larger documents, both market conditions and market analysis, and we'll also be sending you the existing conditions so that we can incorporate your feedback. But just again, as a recap, here are some of the key questions that we're looking to answer as part of that analysis. And then another piece of the puzzle are route profiles, which is where we get really down to on the ground level, looking at the universe of options for improving each route or service. I'm going to just in a minute talk through what that looks like, because it's another, again, opportunity for all of you to provide comment, but we also find these great documents for the riders and the public to provide comment on as well, because they've got really the most intel along with the operators of how service is working today. And then that sort of third leg of the stool, these opportunities for seamless transit. This is the intel that we're collecting from site visits and conversations with the agencies, as well as we review services of where are there opportunities to improve the coordination and investment in transit. And so more to come on this, but there's the service delivery and design piece, but then there's also, again, how do we create a really coordinated experience for riders in the region? So if you go to the next slide, Joe. So just a quick teaser on what route profiles are and what they're going to look like. Again, we do these to really make it on the ground, simplified analysis of not having to look at the network as a whole, but looking at individual routes. And this, again, allows us to get really specific, because the recommendations that come out of this process, we want to be implementable in the near term. And then we can take those route level feedback and then pull it back and incorporate that into larger network recommendations. So if you go to the next slide, so you'll see as these start to come out and we share them with you, you'll see we're summarizing what's working, what's not working, and then just some observations around what can make service better, and then really opening up a conversation with both agencies, operators, staff, and the public at large. And we've got one just kind of quick example. This is the Lakes Region Explorer. Not all of the information is complete yet, so this is certainly a draft. But if you just scroll through the next couple of slides, Joe, you can see how these appear. They're short documents meant to give a quick recap of ridership and productivity, and then just to share some stats, as well as some proposed opportunities for improvement of that route. And again, these are to start a conversation with everyone around what might be improved at, again, a very granular level. And then if you go, yeah, that's great. And then this information, both the conversation we've had today around, again, that more higher level, network level strategies for improving service, meeting market need, looking at the network as a whole, taking that route profile content, again, at the on the ground level, and then the feedback that we get through community and stakeholder engagement, all of that gets baked into network scenarios, which will be network level contrasting options for improving service in the region. And so just a rough timeline here, early 2022, we'll be, again, pulling all these pieces together to get to those network scenarios in early spring, and then getting a very big second round of public engagement push and towards final recommendations in the summer. And so, I expect we'll be not only having our project advisory group meetings, but also be up your way again, hosting workshops with agency staff and other key stakeholders in the region, as well as public engagement. And so we are just about at time, but again, want to just make one more, time for comments. If there's any remaining questions for the advisory group, and then we also can take public comment. It looks like Patricia has her hand raised.
I just have a point of clarification. So as you provide these documents and you develop these like route specific documents, are you going to verify that information with the agency in advance to producing these to a wider audience, just to make sure we get it right? Because it's really hard to walk stuff back.
100%. Yep.
And then the other comment that I just have, and this is just a small thing, but in looking at your website that you have and the head page, the front page there, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like there's a picture of a commuter rail train there, kind of a light rail train, and that like infrastructure doesn't exist anywhere in this network, and that might just get people confused about what this is all about.
Yeah, sorry, that might have been an earlier draft, but noted. Okay. Thanks, Patricia. Any other final questions or comments from our advisory group? Okay, you want to just go to the next slide, Joe? Are there any members of the public who would like to make comment?
I know we got a couple comments, I believe from the public in the chat is where we're going about micro rail, which I assume is streetcar or light rail. At this point, the study has just looked at existing conditions and market demand demographics. So we haven't delved into any sort of improvement ideas, although we are focusing on the existing near-term transit service that are in the area today. But we're not yet at the phase of identifying potential network changes yet. We're just building the foundation at this point in the study.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, well, if you go to the next slide, Joe, I think that kind of wraps it up. I think we just have a quick recap of, next steps. So we got some really good feedback today. We will let you know when the full draft report is available. And again, it will be in draft form for review, and the same for our existing conditions report. And yes, we will be following up with the individual transit agencies. And again, I really appreciate all the data you've provided so that we can produce the route profiles and complete our analysis. And we'll be in coordination with all of you and then gearing up for public outreach in early 2022. And then expect the project advisory group to be reconvening again in February, where we'll probably have more to say on microtransit and be close to completion on all of this work that we presented today. I think that covers it, and we're just a couple minutes over, so appreciate everybody being with us for the duration here, and great conversation. And look forward to more communication from us in the next few weeks, and we'll be sending out the next meeting date soon as well. So thank you very much.
Everyone, enjoy the snow.
Thanks.
And can you stay on for a minute?
Sure. Happy to.
I thought you might want to know that microrail is neither a